Good morning, welcome back. Today is November 21st, and yes, it is cold and raining outside, so here I am today to talk about what happened on this date before we get to talking about Isaiah. Well, first of all, it was on this date in 164 BC during the Maccabean revolt that Judas Maccabeus recaptured Jerusalem. And his recapturing of Jerusalem led to the rededication of the temple. And this whole series of events is celebrated now in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. I'm just letting you know that as we approach the Hanukkah season, that it's based on this event, took place on this date, 164 BC. Well, it was on this date in 1899 that William McKinley met with a group of 5 clergymen to talk about what they were going to do with the Philippines. The Philippines had just come into the possession of the United States as a result of the Spanish-American War. And McKinley had a vested interest because he had been in the Philippines. He had been the governor there, or had done some, been responsible there for a while in his life. But he told this group of clergymen that he had not wanted the Philippines, and I'm just quoting here. He had not wanted the Philippines. He had not wanted the Philippines, but since they had come into the care of the United States, he had gone down on his knees and prayed to the Almighty God for guidance what to do with them. The answer, he believed, was that there was nothing left for us, and he's quoting, I'm quoting here, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ has died. Of course, that McKinley's Christianizing of them led to the Philippine-American War, where 4,200 U.S. citizens were killed, and about at least 20,000 Filipinos were killed, and the American occupation lasted until 1946. Kind of reminded me of the line from Hamilton, where the King George III is singing that, complaining to the colonists that I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love, kind of thing. So in 1931, the movie Frankenstein was released. Okay, this is with Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, in the title role, based on the book by Mary Shelley. And in fact, that's actually a scene right there from the book, or from the movie we're talking about. The movie is kind of interesting, but the book is really, really good. So if you have not actually read the book Frankenstein, I highly recommend it. I highly recommend reading that. In 1953, the Piltdown Man was exposed as a hoax, was officially exposed as a hoax. Now, the Piltdown Man was a skull that was found by a guy named Charles Dawson in Piltdown, England, and presented as the missing link. And the interesting thing about that, now, again, nowadays they say, oh, there were doubts all along, but for about 40 years, it was considered to be one of, if not the missing links. Now, the interesting thing about this is, of course, how long it took to be proven to be false. And that was 41 years to be proven false. And in fact, it was only within the last couple of years, like 2016, I think, is where they finally put a definitive report out showing how the scientific community fell for that particular hoax. But that was all exposed on this date in 1953. In 1976, the movie Rocky premiered. The movie Rocky, great film. If you haven't seen it, we've seen it. I know I've seen it. And of course, we've been to Philadelphia. And if you're a Rocky fan and have been to Philadelphia, you know what you got to do. You got to find the Rocky statue. Here it is. That's a picture we took. And you've got to find the steps to the Museum of Art and run up them. So here's a picture of me up at the top of the steps at the Philadelphia Museum of Art there. Back in, I guess that was in 2019 that we did that. It was on this date in 1980 that the world found out who shot J.R. As you may recall, there was a Dallas TV show that had a cliffhanger, the ultimate, probably the most successful cliffhanger ever, with the main character, played by Larry Hagman, shot. And over the course of the summer, Who Shot J.R. was a huge marketing thing. Made the cover of Time magazine, as you see. And it was exposed, or the season reveal took place on this date in 1980. And I must confess, here we are 41 years later, and I do not know who shot JR, because I was not among the 53 million people who watched that show that day. Okay, I do not know who shot JR. I still do not know who shot JR. I really don't care who shot JR. I'm more interested in the phenomenon of who shot JR than who actually shot JR itself. But that was discovered on this date in 1980. Today is Voltaire's birthday. Voltaire, the French writer, philosopher, a great friend of Benjamin Franklin, by the way. Voltaire wrote Candide, a few other things, had a lot of famous quotations, including "Common sense is not so common," and something to the effect of, "The art of medicine is amusing the patient while nature cures the disease. And every man is guilty of the good they did not do." So Voltaire, born on this date in 1694. In 1785, William Beaumont was born. William Beaumont went on to become an Army surgeon stationed on Mackinac Island, and came into contact with somebody who had been injured in a war, and had a hole in his stomach that literally would not close. And so he would literally just dip things into this guy's stomach and see how it worked, and was able to advance a lot of knowledge in the world of enzymes and indigestion and all that kind of stuff. If you go to Mackinac Island, you can go see his home, you can go see his work area. Kind of an interesting thing, especially if you like that sort of thing. 1912, actress Eleanor Powell was born. Eleanor Powell, probably the only woman figured tap dancer as good, if not better, than Fred Astaire. Was very popular from 1930s, 1940s. And she was in a film with Fred Astaire in 1940. It's called The Broadway Melody of 1940. And if you have not seen this film, or if you don't know who Eleanor Powell is, I highly recommend you go on YouTube and just do Eleanor Powell, Begin, the word begin, start, begin, the Beguine, Beguine, that's the name of a song. And this is arguably considered to be the greatest tap dancing sequence ever filmed. And it's Fred Astaire and Eleanor Powell tap dancing in this particular film. So she was born on this date in 1912. And finally, it was on this date in 1962 that Stephen Curtis Chapman was born. Christian singer, songwriter, actor, Stephen Curtis Chapman was born. So happy birthday, Stephen Curtis Chapman. So with that, let's get back into talking about Isaiah as we're getting close to the end of the book. Yay! So let's get back into that. Good morning, welcome back. And we're here today to start talking about Isaiah 61. And I was kind of looking at it, and I'm thinking that maybe, just maybe, I don't know if this is true or not, or will be true or not, but I think just maybe we're going to finish Isaiah next week. We'll see. We'll see. It's going to be at least one more week, maybe two. But the end is in fact near. Okay, so we're talking about Isaiah 61 today. And if you remember last week, we were finishing up talking about Isaiah 60, where we're thinking all of the great things that are going to happen in the description of the city and what the Lord was going to do. And this is that period where the Lord is saying, okay, here, Israel, the messages are all focused on Israel. Here's what you need to do. In light of all of these, great things that I'm going to do relative to Jerusalem and your nation and all of that, here's what you should do, okay? In light of the grace, how do we live? And so, again, this last chapter of Isaiah 50, of the book of Isaiah 56 through 66 are kind of like, how should we live based in light of what God has done for us, okay? So let's kind of get into talking about this. Now with Isaiah 61, we're going to get into what is clearly one of Isaiah's greatest hits, okay? So let's talk about this. Now I'm going to read the first 3 verses, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. First of all, 61, beginning with verse 1. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant to those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called the oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. Okay, so Isaiah 61 here, the first question you want to ask when looking at these three passages, these three verses is, well, who is talking? Well, in fact, looking through Isaiah 61 altogether, there are three separate places of dialogue. In fact, many look at this and think there are three different people talking, three different groups, organizations, individuals talking here. Okay? And in the first place, in the first three verses, you have to ask yourself, who is doing the talking here? Well, could it be Isaiah? Okay, is it Isaiah? Okay, well, that's possible. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and it is Isaiah's book, and he is the one talking, and he does have the commission from the Lord, okay? Because the Lord has anointed me to bring, and yeah, he does have a commission from the Lord to do what it is he's doing, okay? But you have to look down at all of this other stuff that he said to do. Now, has Isaiah really done that? To proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, to comfort all who mourn? Yeah, probably not. Okay, so although there is an argument to be made that this is Isaiah talking, I don't think really that it is. Okay, you have to kind of look at it as somebody else. Okay, now there's a minority view, and actually I say it a minority view looking at it from a Western evangelical Protestant point of view. But there's one view saying that it's Israel, that it's the nation of Israel, similar to when we talked about Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, that fourth servant song, that this is Israel, that Israel is the one that is supposed to anoint, bring good news to the poor, sent me to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that this is Israel talking, okay? Well, again, it's a possibility. But again, you're not going to get a lot of support for that. Most people tend to look at this and look at a couple of questions about this. Okay, first of all, and this is the third idea, the idea that whoever is speaking has been both sent and anointed. Okay, in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, that combination is only used two other times where it's talked about somebody who is both sent and anointed. Okay, the first time is in 1 Samuel talking about Saul, and the second time is also in Samuel talking about David. So this combination of being sent and anointed is only used three times in the Old Testament, and the first two times it's used talking about the commission of a king. Okay, so that suggests that whoever is getting this anointment and mission is somehow related to the king. Now, we said earlier, we talked that Isaiah might have been in the royal family, which gave him access to Ahaz and all of that, but he wasn't in the direct line. Okay, so that kind of makes people think it's not Isaiah. So then who is it? Who could this possibly be? Okay, now most scholars look at this, and this is both Christian and Jewish scholars look at this and think, given the kingly nature, given the exalted role, this is clearly talking about the Messiah. Okay, this is clearly talking about the Messiah, that the Messiah is referenced here, that the person, and in fact, some people look at this passage, 61:1-3, and say this is actually the fifth servant song. Remember, we talked about the servant songs in chapters 40 through 53. We said that this is the role of the servant and what he is going to bring to the nation of Israel. And here, this is yet another example. Now, it's a different meter, it's a different structure. But some look at this and say that these first three verses hold the same function as the servant songs do, that talk about what the Messiah is going to bring and what the Messiah is going to do. Okay, so most look at this and say this is the Messiah talking. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about what, in fact, he is being asked to do. Okay, it says here that the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted. Now, he's specifically, there are two verbs here. He's been anointed, he's been sent. Okay. Now, the anointment is to bring good news to the poor. The sent explains what the poor element is. Okay. So, in other words, when he says, he's anointed to bring good news to the poor. What does that good news look like? Well, he has sent me to tell him. So the good news to the poor looks like this. Okay? To proclaim, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of the vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant to those who mourn in Zion. Okay? So these things that the Messiah is going to do include these elements, and these are part of God's greater plan. And this actually fits in with what he's been saying throughout Isaiah, talking about what Isaiah's goal. I mean, again, I reiterate over and over and over again, Isaiah 1:17, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. Okay, these are things that Isaiah has been telling the nation of Israel to do all along. Okay, so to proclaim liberty, opening of the prison to those who are bound, proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, etc., etc. Okay, going on with all of these things. Now, an interesting question here, and this kind of gets into biblical interpretation before I'm going to get to the obvious one. And I know some of you are thinking, when are you going to get to the obvious one? But within certain outside of the U.S. views of Christianity, they would look at these verses and they would take these very literally. It's interesting that those of us, and I put myself in that group, who say, no, we believe in literally interpreting the Bible. Okay, within reason, okay, with the historical critical approach kind of thing, that we believe in literally, a literal interpretation of the Bible. Look at verses like this and say, well, not so much. Where there are others, specifically those in Hispanic communities and African American communities, and I guess you could put those together and say outcast communities or minority communities, that look at these verses and say, wait a minute, these verses are a literal promise that when God said to Israel when they were in Egypt, and I'm going to rescue you, it wasn't something that, it wasn't a question of saying, well, someday in heaven you're going to have it okay, so just suck it up now. Okay, it was that God was going to step in, intervene in a big way, which of course in Exodus 1-20 we know he did. And so, and I've mentioned this before, that if you look at this from this outsider point of view, whether it's, again, Hispanic, African American in particular, look at these verses and say, this is just another example, not the only, but that's another example of where the Lord looks at the gospel and looks at the good news that is part and parcel of the gospel, and that there is a literal release coming, okay, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and that as believers, that as people of God, as the whether it's the nation of Israel or the church today, our responsibility to the greater society is to work toward these things: proclaim liberty, opening of the prison, proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, etc., etc. Okay, so that's just kind of an interesting thought, and again, I mean, you can ask yourself, you can say, well, no, I don't think we're okay. Well, then, that is what the verses say. Okay, so that is something to consider, that if you're going to say that they don't mean that, then you're the one that has to do the mental rearranging as far as why the text doesn't, in fact, say what the text, in fact, says. Now, of course, the obvious interpretation of this verse, and what makes it Isaiah's greatest hit, one of Isaiah's greatest hits, I should say, is that this passage is quoted, it's actually read by Jesus in Luke chapter 4. Okay, and the story is in Luke chapter 4, and I've got I've got the new NIV over here. Okay, so Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, and he succeeds. He passes that test, not like Ahaz, who has his test and fails. Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, and we know the story. And then he escapes, gets out of it. He left until an opportune time. Now, in Luke chapter 4, beginning with verse 14, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. So Jesus now comes into Galilee. This is his hometown area, okay? And he's been preaching and teaching, so much so that he's already got a reputation of being a teacher, of somebody to pay attention to, okay? He went to Nazareth, his hometown, where he'd been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it was written. Now that's interesting because in the Jewish tradition, as I understand it, not a Jew, but this is just as I understand it, that if you were a visiting rabbi, then you would have the honor of reciting the Torah, and there would be scrolls, and they would hand you scrolls, and you would read. Now, sometimes there was a sign reading, okay, and that was kind of a way to get through the entire Hebrew Bible in a period of time. There was an assigned reading, and on the first month of the year, we're gonna, like a read through the Bible in a year sort of thing. So they had things like that, okay. But here it's like he's handed the book of Isaiah, and he finds the passage where this is written. So Jesus is looking for this passage. He knows it's in there, and he goes looking for it. He finds Isaiah 61, and he reads. And he reads parts of it. Now, the other point is that the visiting rabbi would be asked to read, and then he could comment, preach on it if he so chose. And he would sit in the center, and people would be around kind of watching and listening to what he had to say, okay? So Jesus grabs this particular passage and he reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Again, if you were a Jew and you knew Isaiah 61 prior to this moment, this is referring to the Messiah. Okay? So any Jew prior to this moment looking at Isaiah 61, anyone from, a Pharisee or whatever, anyone looking at this particular passage would have said, that's talking about the Messiah. Jesus reads this passage, "The Lord has anointed me," and his comment, very short, very sweet. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." What is Jesus claiming there? Jesus is clearly claiming to the Messiah, to the members of the synagogue, you're looking at the Messiah. You are looking at the Messiah, okay? All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from him. Isn't this Jesus? Isn't this Joseph's son? Etc., etc. And he goes on, okay? But clearly, Jesus looks at this passage and says, that's about me. I am the person on whom the Lord has anointed. Okay, so again, now this is, and I've made this point before, that when we look at Isaiah 61, it is not incorrect to look at Isaiah 61 and say that's about Jesus, because we know it is, because Jesus said it is, okay? But it's a splitting hair sort of technicality to say, okay, this is talking about the Messiah, and the Messiah is Jesus. And I only say that because, again, you cannot just take Isaiah 61, throw it in the face of somebody who is an Orthodox Jewish believer and go, well, here, boom, Jesus. Okay? Doesn't quite work that easily. All right? If it did, every Jew in the world would be a believer. Okay? So, Jesus uses this passage in Luke chapter 4, makes it clear that this is me, I am here, and that is when this is coming to fruition. Okay? So, that's verses 1 through 3. Then in verse 4, there's sort of a change of subject, or change of speaker, I should say, verses 4 through 7. And there's some discussion. Most scholars look at this and think that now God is speaking. Okay, now Jesus is no longer quoting this passage, but Isaiah thinks this is God speaking. Others look at this and say it's the servant speaking. Now, that is, it is still the Messiah speaking. Now, I kind of lean toward it's God speaking, but you can differ there if you want. You can differ with anything I say if you want. So here in beginning with verse 4, this is actually just a promise to the city that the Messiah is making, or that God is making. They shall build up the ancient ruins, they shall rise up the former devastations, they shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. Okay, now this is interesting in light of all of the references to abandoned and deserted cities throughout Isaiah. This is kind of one of these running refrains throughout the book, talking about animals wandering through the streets and all that kind of stuff. And now God is telling the nation and telling the people that, hey, at some point you're going to rebuild those cities. You're going to rebuild them. Strangers shall stand and tend your flocks, foreigners shall be your plowmen and vine dressers. But you, that is Israel, shall be called the priests of the Lord. They shall speak of you as the ministers of our God. Now, think about this for a second. Israel isn't being told that you're going to be the rulers. Okay, you're not going to be the dictators. You're not going to be the kings. Okay, here Isaiah is saying your role is going to be the intercessor, to speak, between God and the nations. Okay, and this was kind of what Israel was supposed to be all along. Israel was supposed to be a witness to the nations of what the God who created the world wanted. Okay, Israel was supposed to witness to that effect. Instead of your, they shall speak, you shall eat of the wealth of the nations, and in the glory you shall boast. Instead of your shame, there shall be a double portion. Okay, so Israel is not without its benefits. They're going to have a double portion, similar to what, you know, in the I believe the word is primogeniture, this idea of inheritance where the elder son gets a double portion, the favored son gets a double portion. Instead of dishonor, they shall receive in their lot. Therefore, in their land, they shall possess a double portion. They shall have everlasting joy. Now, this is a great promise to the original readers. So the original readers of the book, what we call the book of Isaiah, would have been those in captivity. Okay. Now, the original hearers at the time that Isaiah spoke this, if in fact he did speak this and somebody's transcribing it or he's reading it or whatever, the original hearers would have been in a time of great stress. Israel has fallen. Things aren't looking good for us. We've got a king who's a little wacky. You know, the original hearers original readers would have been in captivity itself and thought, wow, we're going to have everlasting joy. You know, that's a great promise. May not have been believable at the time to them, but that was the point that the Lord was trying to make. Now in verse 8, we hear another speaker coming in, and this one clearly is the Lord. And we know that because it says, verse 8, for I, the Lord, love justice. Now, do you think Isaiah has beaten this into the ground enough? Okay, I, the Lord, love justice. Again, from Isaiah 1, seek justice. I, the Lord, love justice. Okay, so again, this is something that is near and dear to the heart of the Lord, according to Isaiah. And this is one of the things that even now in 2021, we can look at and say, okay, how are we embodying this love of justice? Okay, are we seeing that in our own lives, in our own communities, in our own sphere of influence? Are we seeing that happen? Okay. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrong. I will faithfully give them their recompense, and I will make an everlasting covenant with them. And again, this is Israel. Their offspring shall be known among the nations, and their descendants in the midst of the peoples. All who see them shall acknowledge them, that they are an offspring the Lord has blessed. Quick side note here. Now, if you look at what Isaiah is saying, is looking at the nation of Israel, and he's saying, listen, guys, there's going to be an everlasting covenant with you. Okay? Their offspring will be known among the nations. Okay? So this suggests, and to me it goes beyond suggestion, but this suggests that there is a very long-term plan for the nation of Israel. Now, this is one of the dividing lines in contemporary Christianity. Okay? What is the role of Israel in the future? Especially, what is the role of Israel compared to the role of the church? Okay, so now there are a couple of different ways to look at this. At least a couple, and there may be more. I don't know. People come up with new ways all the time. One way to look at this is to say that the church that comes about in the book of Acts in the New Testament has replaced Israel. That the nation of Israel is no longer God's people. And the church, those who have believed the gospel, those who have accepted Christ as their Savior, has become God's people. Okay? Now, you can find this, you know, and this is part of the basis of what is often referred to as covenant theology, that you will see this as part of, and again, I'm grossly oversimplifying, okay, as covenant theology. Whereas there's another school of thought that has come about in the last 150, 200 years that looks at this and says, again, going back to the literal translation kind of thing, that says, you know what? If the Bible says that there's an everlasting covenant. Okay, everlasting, not until the church comes along, but everlasting with Israel, then there is an everlasting covenant with Israel. That something about this people group that is referred to as Israel is going to have an everlasting covenant, okay? And so when you get into the book of Revelation and it talks about things happening with Israel, okay, 144,000 Jews and all of that kind of stuff, that those things are literally going to happen, that there is a literal role for the people that we called Israel in the Old Testament, okay? This is generally in the world of interpretation called dispensationalism. Okay, now we don't have time to go into the differences between covenant theology and dispensationalism, and there's different grades of all of them. Okay, but still, this is one of the questions you have to ask yourself, especially as you go through into the New Testament or investigating or reading through and studying, especially Revelation. You have to ask yourself, okay, what is the role of Israel? And what is the role of the church? Are they one and the same, or are there something else? So a dispensationalist, and I fall into the dispensationalist camp, a dispensationalist would say, no, there is a role for Israel, and there is a role for the church. There's two different bodies, okay? So that's all I'm going to say on this at this point, except to look at verse 9b. It says, all who see them shall acknowledge them that they are an offspring the Lord has blessed. So everybody is going to look at the nation of Israel, and they're going to be so obviously blessed that the world is going to notice. Now, let me ask you this. Based on what you can see today, 2021, has this happened with Israel? Do people look at the nation of Israel? Does the world look at the nation of Israel and say, wow, that is proof that God has blessed them? I'm going to go with a no at this point. Now, perhaps something is going to change. Perhaps there's going to be a great revival in Israel. I don't know. But I'm just saying, has that happened yet? I don't think so. Okay, so this is getting back to something I said earlier. Is the current day Israel what, this Israel that has the settlements and all that stuff going on, capital Tel Aviv, moved to Jerusalem? Is that all the biblical Israel? I suggested earlier that I don't think it is. Well, I didn't suggest. I said I don't think it is. Okay. Some believe it is, and that's okay. I'm just saying this is one of those kind of deals that you kind of have to think through, especially as you're creating a doctrine of end times, eschatology, this doctrine of last things. Verse 10 starts off Zion, that is usually Jerusalem speaking on behalf of the nation. Okay, so when we talk about Zion, we're talking about Jerusalem on behalf of the nation. I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My soul shall exult in my God, for he has clothed me with garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself like a priest with a beautiful headdress, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels, for as the earth brings forth its sprouts, and as a garden causes what is sown in it to sprout up, so the Lord God will cause righteousness and praise to sprout up before all the nations. Now we're going to hold that thought on here at the end of verse 10. We're talking about the bridegroom thing. We're going to hold that thought for a few verses. Let's get into chapter 62. Okay. Now again, in chapter 62, we have to ask ourselves who's talking. And again, this is part of the problem with looking at Isaiah. You have to always kind of ask yourself who's talking, who's saying that. Okay, because it matters. It matters as far as the interpretation. If it's God talking, if it's Isaiah talking, if it's a guy who sells newspapers on the corner is talking. It makes a difference as far as who is talking. Okay, so in verses 1 through 5, there's a question usually, is it Isaiah talking? Is this Isaiah kind of recounting something? Or is it the Lord talking? Okay, let's read the first 5 verses and then we'll come back to that question. For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not be quiet, until her righteousness goes forth as brightness, and her salvation as a burning torch. The nations shall see your righteousness, and all the kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall be no more termed forsaken, and your land shall be no more termed desolate. But you shall be called, my delight is in her, and your land married. For the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your sons marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. All right, so who's talking here? Is it Isaiah? Is it the prophet? Is it the prophet? Is it God? Okay. Now there's been a shift. Now at first, like the first 5 or maybe 1,000 years of biblical interpretation history, and this was when we talk about, you know, John of Chrysostom and Tertullian and Origen and all the Augustine, all those guys looked at this passage when they commented on it, and they would say, well, that's God talking. Okay. Now later, I think it's starting with John Calvin, and it's kind of interesting. You know, Calvin, the Geneva reformer, second generation Reformation dude, founder of what we call Presbyterianism and Calvinism, actually wrote a commentary on I believe it's every book in the New Testament except for Revelation. And so it's kind of interesting how pivotal his commentaries were in terms of talking. And now Luther wrote a lot of commentaries as well. Just Calvin's seem to be more quoted. But so I think Calvin was the first one to kind of look at it and go, no, I don't think that's God talking. I think that's the prophet talking. And if you look at Isaiah 6, 9, and 10, okay, and the 6, 9, and 10 says that, okay, you're going to preach, but nobody's going to listen to you, and you're going to witness, and nobody's going to believe it, etc., etc. It's kind of hard to understand why he would say verses 2 and 3, the nations shall see your righteousness, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. So he's all these great things that are going to happen, but yet that's not what was promised to Isaiah. Okay, that would happen to Isaiah the prophet. However, looking at verses 3 and 4, speaking of God in the third person, now that's kind of weird. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall be no more turned forsaken, and your land shall no more be turned desolate. Now, given the fact that, you know, Isaiah is prophesying here, so I think it's easier to get around, I don't know if that's the right word, but it's easier to get around the objections to Isaiah being the person talking in verse 2 and 3 by just saying he's prophesying. He's saying, yeah, I know you're not believing me now, but someday this is what's going to happen. Okay? You shall be called by a new name. And note, he's looking at this nation, he's saying, Jerusalem, Israel, Zion, someday you're going to draw people to you. Okay? The nation shall see your righteousness, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. You shall be a crown of beauty and a royal diadem. You know, that people will see that, and that will be a draw. People will be attracted to you. Okay? You shall be called, my delight is in her, and your land married. Now, if you have an NIV, translates that, and but you shall be called Hephzibah. You know, and if we had a daughter, we would have named her Hephzibah. In your land, Beulah. Okay? Now, the Hebrew words there mean, Hephzibah means my delight is in her, and Beulah means married, to be married, which of course made me start thinking about that old hymn, Dwelling in Beulah Land. All those times I'm dwelling in Beulah Land, I'm thinking, okay, I'm dwelling in married land. What were they trying to, you know, teach me as a young teenager that, you know, I digress. Okay. For the Lord delights in you. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your sons marry you. Again, this draw, your attractiveness is going to be such. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. Now here, and again, I'm going to draw back in that phrase in verse 10 of chapter 61, where Jerusalem and Israel are referred to as a bride. Okay, and I think, and we know in the New Testament that the church is often referred to as the bride of Christ. And so some have looked at that and said, well, if Jerusalem is referred to as a bride, and the church is referred to as a bride, then it must be the same thing, okay? Not necessarily, okay? It's just, they're just talking about using the bride metaphor, I think is the right word, to explain the situation. Doesn't mean they're the same thing, okay? But that is one of the supports, one of the arguments that's made to say, okay, well, Israel and the church are the same thing because they're both referred to as a bride, okay? I don't think they're used in quite the same way or with quite the same intensity. You know, here in Isaiah, the attractiveness of the bride to the groom is used to illustrate how the nations are going to be attracted to Israel. Whereas in the New Testament, when it talks about the bride of Christ, the church being the bride of Christ, talking about the relationship of the church to Christ in the eternal scheme of things. Okay, so I don't think it's quite the same thing, but again, if you're looking into that, if you're looking into dispensationalism versus covenant theology, this is a passage that you would want to kind of take into account here. Verse 6, and I think here it's the prophet speaking, "On your walls, O Jerusalem, I have set watchmen. All the day and all the night, they shall never be silent." Now, this is something that has kind of gone through several times. We've seen this idea of watchmen on the walls. And now Isaiah is talking here about, "I've set watchmen. Here's what they're going to tell me. They shall never be silent. You who put the Lord in remembrance, take no rest." Now, what he's talking about here is actually within the court system, maybe not strictly Jewish, but within the court system, there were different people that had different roles. Okay, and there was one person that was often referred to as the recorder, and the recorder today would be, I don't know about a particular job title, but it would be the person in charge of the calendar, the person in charge of keeping track of things, the person reminding them. Now, if you've ever seen a movie or a show where there's somebody who's very powerful, whether he or she is the CEO of a major company, president of the United States, whatever, there's always somebody, and I assume that's standing next to him or her with a notebook and going, "Okay, you have a 10 o'clock appointment with so-and-so, you have a 10, kind of just reminding the person this is what you have to do. And I think Isaiah is referring to that role. Okay, this is just one of the roles that people had within the royal court. Okay, there were other people. There's kind of a side note. There's another interesting role that there were people within the court whose job it was to challenge the assumptions of the king about people in the kingdom. That, to say, okay, are you sure about this guy? Maybe you should look into this guy. Now, that person's role in ancient times was referred to, or let me stop for a minute there. We first hear about this role in the book of Job, okay? And that person's role in the Hebrew was called the Hasatan. And the Hasatan's job was to bring to the attention of the ruler and say, hey, are you sure about this guy? Are you sure about this guy? That was just his or her job. I guess it was always him, but And so what we've done is looked at that person. So in Job, in the Hebrew, it says the person holding this role went to God and said, what about Job? Okay, and now we've looked at it and said, well, Hasatan, and we've taken that name Hasatan and made it a name, Satan. Just like in when we talked about Isaiah 14, we talked about Lucifer. Okay, Lucifer is just the name of the star, and we looked at that and made it a name. Okay, similar idea. Maybe if we talk about Job someday, we'll get into that. But let's get back into this. Okay, so he's saying, those of you who remind the Lord of things, let him know. Okay, so this is really a call to prayer, is really what it comes down to. And give him no rest until he establishes Jerusalem. Guys, keep praying, kind of remind God what he's prayed for us. And this is sort of an instruction in prayer. And this is kind of, when people talk about praying the psalm, we're just kind of repeating the psalm. Lord, you promised you were going to do this, make it happen. You promised you were going to do this, make it happen. Okay, and give him no rest until he establishes Jerusalem and makes it a praise in the earth. The Lord has sworn by his right hand and by his mighty arm, I will not again give your grain to be food for your enemies, and foreigners shall not drink your wine for which you have labored, but those who garner it shall eat it and praise the Lord, and those who gather it shall drink it in the courts of my sanctuary. So, hey, keep reminding God of this stuff. Those of you who are standing there going, hey, just keep reminding them of this. Okay, so again, keep reminding God of what he has already promised to do. All right. Now in verse 10, we have a question answered. I know you'd think, what question was that? Well, the question is this. Okay, so given the fact that God has promised all of this, that he's going to do all of this, that the Messiah is going to come and do this, and Israel is going to be this great thing, what should Israel be doing? And verse 10 gives us the answer, and the answer is to take action. Go through the gates, prepare the way for the people, build up the highway, clear it of stones, lift up a signal over the peoples. Behold, the Lord has proclaimed to the end of the earth. Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your salvation comes. Behold, his reward is with him. Okay? It's interesting. So what is this talking about? Okay? This, prepare the way. Remember in chapter 40, a voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way. Okay? In Isaiah chapter 2, Isaiah talked about, talked about creating this highway that is going to draw people to Israel, that's going to draw people to the mountain where God will dispense his justice. Okay, and here it says, get busy on this. Get to doing stuff, okay? Prepare for the entrance of the believers here. Go through the gates, prepare the way for the people, build up the highway, clear it of stones. Okay, lift up a signal over the people. Take action, do something. Okay, get busy. That's kind of the point here. This isn't a, well, God's going to take care of it. I'm going to just sit here and wait for it to happen. No, get out there and make it happen. Find a role here. And his recompense before him, and they shall be called the holy people, the redeemed of the Lord, and you shall be called sought out, a city not forsaken. Verse 12. Keep on doing this, get busy doing this, and this is what's going to happen. You shall be called a city sought out, a city not forsaken. Okay? Again, this passage suggests a continued existence for the nation of Israel. Okay? So, again, I lean toward the dispensationalist side. Okay? But there's a lot of great people who are covenant kind of covenant theologians, or successionist is another view. The idea that the promises given to Israel now apply to the church, that the church has succeeded Israel, successionism kind of thing. But that's that. So in in chapter 63, we take a little new tack. Okay. Now the Lord is talking about, this is what's going to happen in Israel, in Jerusalem. Now what's happening in the rest of the land? Who is this? And I'm just going to talk about the first 6 verses here. Let me just read them to you. Who is this who comes from Edom in crimson garments from Bozrah? He who is splendid in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. It is I, speaking in righteousness, mighty to save. Why is your apparel red and your garments like his who treads in the winepress? I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. I trod them in my anger and trampled them in my youth. Their lifeblood spattered on my garments and stained all my apparel. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and my year of redemption had come. I looked, but there was no one to help. I was appalled, but there was no one to uphold. So my arm brought me salvation, and my wrath upheld me. I trampled down the peoples in my anger. I made them drunk in my wrath. I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. Okay? Here the Lord is coming, so perhaps the question is, on what basis can you say that Israel is going to become the dominant nation, at least in terms of ministering and preparing the way? Because the Lord has done all he said. When we talk about Isaiah 13 through 23, and even through 27, we talk about all these different judgments. Here the Lord is coming back saying, okay, I did all of that. Okay, I did it by myself because there was no man that could help me on this. I did all that. I took care of all of that. Now, if this, in verses 3, 4, and 5, again, there's been another historical shift on this one. Some people have looked at this and said, okay, this is talking about Jesus and the crucifixion. This is kind of getting into this idea of there's blood. Jesus bled, therefore it must be about Jesus on the cross. Yeah, and not necessarily, okay? The problem with looking at these parallels, you kind of get overboard. You can look at it and say, well, Jesus had a mother. Well, Manasseh had a mother. So Manasseh is just like Jesus, right? Well, they both had mothers. Okay, so, just because there's a parallel doesn't necessarily mean the one prefigures the other. Okay, so here this is just really God saying, listen, I've accomplished all that I said I was going to do. Okay, remember I said in Isaiah 9, I think it was, where he said, I purposed I'm going to make it happen. Okay, now if this passage sounds vaguely familiar to you, okay, it isn't necessarily because, I don't know Isaiah's greatest hits, but if you've ever heard the song written by Julia Ward Howe called the Battle Hymn of the Republic, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord, he is trampling out his vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored, that is based on images now she would have been coming out of the King James, but that is based on images coming out of Isaiah 63. I've seen them in the Watchfires of 100. I don't have the words right in front of me. But again, the words of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, or in outside of the U.S., it's called Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory. But again, this is kind of that song is based on the images in this particular chapter. And so the Lord has said, listen, I've accomplished what I said I'm going to accomplish, the judgment part. And that reiterates the point that we've been making all along, and that is that the judgment itself is not the issue. That is not the point. The point is not the judgment. The point is getting to Israel, where Israel can be the witness to God's work on earth like he initially said it was going to. Okay? So, looking at the end here in verse 6, I trampled down the people. This is the Lord bringing the vengeance that he promised. And again, you can look in Revelation 14, some things about that. But you know what? Before you get too critical about what's going on, remember that in Isaiah 53:12, where we talk about how the servant is going to pour out his lifeblood on the earth, and we can talk about the crucifixion of Christ and what he did on our behalf as well. Okay. Next week, perhaps we're going to finish Isaiah. I don't know, maybe. But we're going to talk about the Lord's mercy remembered. We're going to pick up in Isaiah 63, verse 7. So thank you very much for being with me, and I hope to see you next week.